Hi, I'm Chris Sarandon, and welcome to Cooking by Heart, where we revisit the vivid memories of the food we grew up with.
I couldn't believe the tastes and the flavors.
Lydia Bastianic. Hi, Chris. Susan Sarandon.
And, of course, the people and the stories attached to that time in our lives.
I was the one sort of like mommy dearest.
He'd order one side of the menu, he'd eat that. And then when he was finished eating that, he'd order the other side of the menu, and he'd all of that. Emptied the kitchen.
My guest today is the multi-talented actor, producer, director, and author, Illeana Douglas. Illeana's upbringing is a fascinating contrast between her paternal family's glamorous Hollywood world and her mother's working-class Queens, New York, Italian, Romanian roots. Douglas began her professional acting career with a Scream, more on that later, and moved on to acting roles in such films as Martin Scorsese's Cape Fear and Goodfellas, Message in a Bottle, Gus Van Sant's To Die For, and the film Alive, among many, many others. Her television roles include The Larry Sanders Show, Ugly Betty, Law & Order SVU, and 6 Feet Under, the latter earning her an Emmy nomination for Guest Actress in a Drama. She was also guest starring on such shows as Seinfeld, Frasier, Entourage, The Drew Carey Show, and again, among many, many others. Douglas also worked on the Turner Classic Movie series Friday Night Spotlight, a movie festival programmed by special guests, and she continued her TCM association by presenting a month-long series called Trailblazing Women, highlighting women's contributions to the art of cinema. She created and starred in the highly regarded web series Easy to Assemble, and she's also authored 2 books, her fascinating and hilarious memoir, I Blame Dennis Hopper, and her most recent, Connecticut in the Movies. She was named for Princess Illeana of Romania, and I'm proud to introduce Illeana of Connecticut. Welcome to Cooking by Heart.
Hi, nice to talk to you, Chris.
It's great to have you here, Illeana.
Thank you.
Now, one of the things that I touched upon in your introduction was we start the show always with Provenance, where we're from, right? Which was a kind of movable feast for you as you were younger and growing up, right?
Yes.
First of all, what were the early days like with mom and dad when things were settled and you thought you had a kind of, clear path?
Well, my early days were originally with my grandparents growing up in Queens. It seems today as if that was uncommon, but I know that, when I was growing up, I think that my parents were going through some things. So they, had my grandparents and various Italian relatives raising me. That's why it took me many years to kind of put that together, because I often wondered why I had a New York accent, and I was going to school trying to be a preppy, and everyone was like, "You sound like you're from Queens," And all of my references were, the Honeymooners and the Groucho Marx and baseball. Right. And I finally kind of put it together many years later that my a lot of my early years were spent with, Italian immigrants. And so I probably picked up a lot of their mannerisms.
So what age?
I mean, this is like right when I was born. Again, there was, it's so funny. There's pictures of me as a baby, and I'm in a kind of 1950s Queens living room with plastic on the furniture. So it was that kind of going back and forth, and then by the time I got back with my own family, that was in down in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, and then that's where, which I think was the origin, sort of again, of the book. This push and pull with identity of, who am I? I was always trying to be a Connecticut person, but then I would go to New York and spend time with my relatives, and I always felt more comfortable there. Obviously, more cosmopolitan. I would spend time with my grandfather on the Upper West Side. So then there was that identity.
Right. Your grandfather?
Melvin Douglas.
Correct. The movie actor, wonderful, wonderful movie actor, and stage actor from the 40s, 30s, 40s up until he passed away in what, the 80s?
Yes, and I think it's like 1980. But his studio career ended in 1949, 1950. Like a lot of actors did. They went to London. I mean, it's sort of the same today when we talk about suddenly everybody's working in Pittsburgh.
Yep.
Suddenly everybody's working in Canada. It seems like in the early 50s, everybody went to London to do films. And then post that, he did Broadway and then sort of resurfaced as a character actor.
Right.
But so by the time I was growing up and staying with them, I would go back and forth between my Queens childhood and seeing movies and, very much about, the New York Post and sports and pop culture. And then with my grandfather was, strictly the New York Times and theater and being very literate and reading the latest books. So for me, it was always a push-pull between what family am I a part of? And then I would come back to Connecticut, where I didn't, where I felt I fit in kind of the least.
And what are your first memories of, say, for instance, were you old enough to have memories of the food that you were eating with your grandparents in Queens?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. So, from a little kid, of course, the smell of, tomatoes, basil, hot peppers. I would stay with my cousins out in Northport, and my grandmother's sister, they had an outdoor kitchen there, and they would, so the smell of hot peppers cooking in oil, you could smell the chicken coop and the duck coop and having those kind of eggs for breakfast. And one of my favorite memories, I mean, of course you chase food tastes for the rest of your life.
Yes, right.
But my grandmother used to work at a department store called Gertz. And after she would finish work, we would go to this little pizza parlor and have pizza that was like, the most gigantic slice of greasy pizza with your paper and grease dripping off of it, etc.
Right. You're contrasting this then with, now there were salad days, that is, the expression salad days, when you first were in Connecticut, correct? With your parents? When things were going well, your father was working, he was working in the city. Was he commuting?
Yeah, commuting. Yeah. And then we veered into our, kind of hippie days.
Yeah, right. But in the earlier time, that is the time when things were quote unquote rich, as you describe it in your book, what was your mom cooking?
She was always cooking, Italian food. That's what I kind of really grew up with, because that was very much a tradition of seeing my grandmother cook and then teaching everything to my mother. And my mother, is still a very good cook. Also, because it was the 70s, she was doing a lot of that, clipping from the newspaper, and, you'd make a Chinese meal or you'd make Mexican tacos. Yeah. So there was that kind of era where you were trying different things. Yeah. Her specialty was this very strange thing called salmon mousse. Ooh. That was, it was high 70s. It was very glamorous,
Yes.
Very presentational. And
right.
She'd make cakes and different things like that.
Did your dad do any cooking at all?
Oh my God. He because he was the hippie, it was odd. Like he tried to get milk from the goats. That was never successful. So I always remember cheesecloths and things hanging in the kitchen. Right. And it never being successful. And then we went through the phase of, that people were doing hamburger helper, but so he was trying to do something better than hamburger helper. So he would use oatmeal. So I remember a lot of raw hamburgers, cooked hamburgers with oatmeal, right? Foraging mushrooms,
right.
So it was a lot of the hippie food.
Well, the hippie food requires some explanation because there was a very specific event that occurred that turned things around completely in your family from this suburban, relatively well-to-do suburban Connecticut family to things change one day. What happened?
Well, I mean, again, I was just very young, but in writing about it, is essentially this was the era my father saw the movie. I blamed Easy Rider, and a lot of things were going on in the community where we were, Wesleyan University, a lot of uprisings, things like that. And that's when he decided to leave his work and, become a hippie and start a commune with other people from Wesleyan. And so that's when essentially my father in my life became like a movie character. He became Dennis Hopper. That was the last time I kind of recognized any kind of father knows best existence.
Right.
And that was when I, again, a lot of strange, and some of it was very, don't get me wrong. It was like, it was very fun and colorful and musicians around, but I lost any sense of an identity of a father figure.
Right.
And that transferred then to my grandparents and my grandfather.
Right.
From that point on.
The menu changed a lot as well, right, at home?
Yeah, because we went from, again, like probably, I guess you'd say upper middle class, as I was saying before, mom cooking things out of the newspaper and, a very kind of 70s upper middle class childhood to suddenly, a tuna for 4 people.
A can
of never seeing meat again, never seeing steak again, a lot of pasta. And although she denies this, I mean, I think it's funny, but she did one day say, she yelled up and said peanut butter or jelly. She denies that happened.
Right.
My worst experience of being like poor was cream cheese sandwiches, which just felt like you'd sit in the lunchroom and people would have, what it seemed to me normal lunches with a lot of food. And I was eating cream cheese on bread and not a lot of cream cheese either.
It had to spread very, very, very far, right?
Yes.
How many siblings did you have?
2 older brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's an Italian family, they were the boys, and it always seemed to me that they got more food than me. So when I would go to Queens, of course, that's when I would, eat to my heart's content.
Right. What was the conversation around the dinner table at home with your brothers and your family? As I recall, this is where we get that kind of separation of my father's in his commune, and everybody, I describe it as like being that is when I believe my own 5-cent psychology is that when I sort of started pretending my life was a movie, because it seemed like a movie with all these characters from the commune in it. And I think because maybe my brothers were older than me, that's when I started veering into being obsessed with the movies and with a more standard kind of a upbringing. I discovered because I would go to my grandfather's, as I said, and there'd be all this food in abundance and room service, and then I would go back and we'd be back to tuna and cream cheese sandwiches. So that's what I began to think. Oh, God.
So there wasn't a lot of like talks around the family table. That all occurred in my Italian. I think that's why I gravitated towards that family life, because that was where I was experiencing, all the standard things, going on vacation, going to Jones Beach, etc.
Yeah.
In my hippie childhood, we didn't do things like that because that was crass and commercial.
Right.
You know what I mean? You only were into protesting and raising goats and
right. And then you also would go and visit your grandfather in they had a house in Vermont.
Yeah, they had a house, an incredible house in Fairleigh, Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me was always great part of the summer because we drive up there, and again there'd be an abundance of food, which thrilled me.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember anything in particular?
Oh my God! Well, that was the first time I recognized English muffins. I think that's the first time I saw an English muffin. Is my grandfather would get up late, and he always looked, stylish. He always looked like right out of one of his films.
Oh, really?
He had sulka pajamas and a bathrobe, and they had a pot of. I always thought, well, that's what rich people never put butter in the refrigerator. It was on the table, like old school, it was covered, and you had your butter, and then 2 types of jam, strawberry and marmalade. And so he would have English muffins. He'd have his coffee, English muffin with butter and marmalade. And so, of course, and on this incredible blue china. So, that became my ideal. Mm-hmm. These were these little things that I was picking up. Like, okay, that's what rich people do. They have,
right.
They don't have huge breakfasts like people in Queens.
Yes, because they have to go to work and, burn it off.
Exactly.
Yeah,
they eat very, and then they have boiled chicken for, right. That was always my first, I always thought, rich people do not eat a lot. It's very fancy. Mm-hmm. Like you sit down to dinner and there's a lot of, they're not throwing sandwiches like Italians do.
Right. And the portions are quite different as well.
Exactly. Yeah. You sit down and that was another thing I remember. I think that's the first time I ever saw a lamb chop. That's what rich people ate.
Yes.
Lamb chop and 3 peas on a plate.
Lamb chops with mint?
Yeah.
Which I can't.
Mint jelly.
Yeah, I'm not big on that, but I do remember going to homes of friends when I was growing up because, I grew up in a Greek household. My dad and mom were both. And my father owned a restaurant. So when my mom cooked lamb, it was highly cooked, not pink, and also laced with garlic and lots of oregano, and with potatoes that are bathed in olive oil. And I mean, it was totally different from the restaurant. But when I went to a friend's house, I remember vividly once, and they had lamb chops, and I was thinking, and I sat down and there was a hunk of green something on the plate, and I couldn't figure out what the hell it was until I tasted it. And then, of course, it's been an anathema to me ever since.
Yes. Well, that's what, that's what they ate. And then again, for dessert, it'd be maybe a tiny piece of pie or something like that with a very delicate bit of ice cream on it. I wrote in my book that I remember being with my grandfather in the Upper West Side when Haagen-Dazs was first invented. And that was like a huge thing for us to go to Zabar's. Again, for me, I couldn't believe Zabar's to me was like, again, growing up without a lot of food in the house. That was and is to this day like a destination. It brings back memories for me, but the idea that you could go up and down the grocery and get anything you wanted seemed unbelievable to me. It still does.
Yeah, I understand completely. And also, there were some very specific experiences with your grandfather where he took you out in his car.
Yes, that was. Well, yeah, that was up in Vermont. I remember, the big thing to do up in Vermont was you'd go, pick strawberries or blueberries or things like that. And he had it was like a 1959 Mercedes convertible, and nobody wanted to be in the car with him because he was such an atrocious driver.
Oh, really?
But I loved it. And so, we would drive around Lake Maury, and I remember going, we had to go to the airport to pick somebody up, and him, hitting And I just thought, yeah, that's how movie stars drive. They just knock over pylons, and, you know,
mailboxes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Go through mail. There goes Melvin Douglas.
Right.
Stay out of the way.
Yes. and you were kind of the default passenger when nobody else wanted.
Oh my God! Because, and again, these are things you put together later on in your life, like that sense of being with somebody that, dressed in a very specific way. He was a movie star to everybody. And, that sense of luxury and doing whatever you wanted. Of course, I became very enamored with that. I think that's part of my hero worship of movie stars, especially movie stars of the past. You know, they just seem to walk a foot above the rest of us. We're all, I wrote this in my book. I remember him taking me to Sardi's for the first time, which was very exciting.
Yeah. Been there many times with Broadway show openings. Yeah.
Do you remember that, but when you've read about something as a kid and then you're there and it's like, okay, I'm here. This is just, it looks just like the photographs. And people, that slow motion walk that movie stars do, saying hello to everybody.
Right. He probably had his caricature on the wall there.
He did. Yeah. He did. From I believe the play was Spofford. It was a Hirschfeld that was up there. But I remember I would always want to go there. It wasn't really his cup of tea. He wasn't really a theatrical person, but I want to go there just have that experience. And I always remember getting these gigantic portions. And years later, when I moved to New York, I said to someone, we have to go to Sardi's because they give these huge portions. And then that's when I realized, we got the Melvin Douglas size portions. It had nothing to do with the restaurant. So I realized that a lot. I said, okay, now I understand.
Yeah, Sardi's, for my listeners and my viewers, to explain, this is the place where traditionally not only actors went to eat, say between a matinee and an evening performance, but also where you gathered after an opening to read the reviews, so that it was either a celebration dinner after the show or it was a funeral, essentially. And I'd been to a couple of funerals at Sardi's. And the food, by the way, was never particularly good. It was the atmosphere. It was it was just the fact that it was the place to go for if you wanted to be on Broadway.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that was always part of my trip, was always I'd get to see a Broadway show and then we'd go to Sardi's, or of course the other one I insisted on.
Right.
Because I saw it in a movie, was, the 21 Club. So they're kind of, or Café des Artistes. Yes. I mean, if I read about it.
One of the things I wanted to touch on with you, because I know that you had an earlier experience with food when you were a young teenager. You were a server in a rather interesting restaurant, the Camelot.
Yes, it was called, I was trying. As I was writing about it in my book, I knew I wanted to be in show business.
Right.
I didn't exactly know how, but I wanted to be in show business because my grandfather was in show business. And then, he said, well, if you want to be an actor, you have his advice was always, circa 1930, you go out on the road and Jesse Bonistel will take you through Wisconsin and,
summer stock and.
Exactly. Yeah. So his theatrical starts were with, Ralph Bellamy and doing Shakespeare out in, Wisconsin and stuff. So I was thinking, how the hell, this is the 70s. How am I going to find a place to be in theater? There is no theater in Connecticut. The kind of theater that I thought he was talking about. And then miraculously, this place opens called the Camelot Dinner Theater.
Yep.
And as I write, it was a place where, careers went to die. It was probably Donald O'Connor's last show. Richard Kiley's, 80,000 performance of Man of La Mancha,
right.
Things like that. And it was ill-fated from the beginning, but I lied about my age, and I got myself a job there as a...
How old were you?
Oh, I think in actuality, I was 15.
Oy.
And there's a photograph of me in my book. I was so naive that I actually, it said they were hiring people, and I rode my bike there, and I actually had taken a picture of myself in 8x10 with like a hat and a veil. I mean, it's so mortifying, and I handed the guy, who was doing the interviews, he said, no, all the actors get cast out of New York. Like, we're hiring, bus people and hostesses. We're not hiring actors. And he said, but, sometimes like they might need someone in the chorus or something like that. So he asked me, as I wrote in my book, he asked me if I was 16, and I lied and said I was. And then immediately I got fired from being a cocktail waitress, because I didn't know. Somebody ordered a VO and 7, and I thought they must mean a V8 and 7. And I brought it to the table. The guy got mad at me. What the hell is this? And I was immediately fired. But I begged the guy, please, could I do something else? So he put me in hostessing, and that was a revelation to me, because as you know, in show business, you just fake it till you make it. And I realized that, this is all I have to do is hostess for basically just get people in their seats, and then I'm free. And then that's when I immediately hightailed it backstage and kind of pretended I was someone official, and whoever was performing, I would just sidle up to them and say, do you need anything? Would you like some coffee? Or, just try to make myself seem like I was important.
Yes.
And that's where I met Riddy Valley. But got advice from him. But I was at least proving to my grandfather that I was in some form of show business.
And now, given the fact that the people who were running this place were a little less than David Merrick quality.
Well, as you know, or maybe know, in Connecticut, when I was growing up, I mean, obviously we have to have prostitution, but we're surrounded by the woods, and so the nudge nudge wink wink was always, you'd get a hotel on the Berlin Turnpike was always rumored to be
where the rendezvous took place.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my understanding from the owners, because he told me this, was that this was a way to launder money through this, which would make sense because, and here's what's so funny, Chris. So I'm a child, and watching all of this, and it seems very exciting to me. Now, cut to many years later when I'm an actor and I'm grown up, and I have to tell you, I'm in the reverse. Like, oh, okay, I'm in one of those situations where I'm never going to get paid. The producers are. This is, these are kind of things that this sort of set me up for. This is not uncommon,
Which actually happened with this place, right?
Right. And meanwhile, you had sincere actors, coming there, putting on a show, trying to get credits, going to Vegas. And that's what I put in. And one night, which I wrote about in my book, it was absolutely crazy. During the show Man of La Mancha, and they always served the same thing, which I don't think I ever ate. It seems so Connecticut. Prime rib. It's just something that was the dinner theater, prime rib and mashed potatoes. And during Man of La Mancha, while Richard Kiley was singing, I am Don Quixote, this man keeled over in his prime rib and had a heart attack and died.
You're kidding.
And the show, again, as you know, in these theatrical things, like they didn't know on stage. So they're continuing, I am dead. What's going on? Is something happening? Yeah, So all this whispering ensued. Finally, the lights come up, and sure enough, the man is, as I always said, he was literally killed by show business.
Right.
In his prime rib.
Yes.
And to this
And
day,
mashed
I can't
potatoes.
look at prime rib without thinking of him.
Totally understandable.
A short time later, I went to work, and that they had absconded with all the money and the people that were left. And I remember, again, this very kind of poignant thing of actors showing up and trying to put on a show, because people were coming there.
Yep.
And then you had the other faction of people that worked in the kitchen saying, like, no, there's no show. There's no, like,
Right.
there's just no, and they're gone. Like, it's over. And you had the actors going, but we could still do the show, couldn't we?
God.
I love actors.
Oh, I do too. And speaking of actors, as you grew older, then you became part of a program at the Harford Stage Company?
Yeah, so this was my life changing. So after the Camelot Dinner Theater ended, I was like, all right, I was at a low point, because thinking, I don't know how, I mean, again, with no money to go to school and a dream to be in show business and a little bit of talent and a lot of moxie, I saw this ad in the newspaper for what they then called inner city youth, at risk of people living in Hartford. And I just lied. Like, I had to get into this program. I knew it was my ticket.
You were at risk. I mean,
Yeah, I just wasn't. I just wasn't from Hartford.
No.
So I asked a family that I knew lived in a, what you would call a bad neighborhood in Hartford, and asked them if I could use their address. And I got it. And by doing a sort of impression of Liza Minnelli from Maybe This Time, I somehow got into this group. And I have to say, these were, this was the opposite of salad days. These are like the apple days. So probably for that point, for the next 10 years, I think I learned to survive on, an apple. You play games with yourself. Like, well, if I have an apple, it's like, for dinner, I could, have the other half. Or if I have coffee all day, I won't need the apple, and I could save the apple till tomorrow. And I had this epiphany of saying, oh, this is, they always say poor people are lazy. And I'm like, yeah, because we're starving. We're starving all the time.
You have no energy.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's where food, my secondary obsession with food kind of came into play, because you would try to figure out, I remember there was a place called Ryan's Deli, and they would leave pickles out on the table. I'd try to figure out, like, are pickles a meal? Can I have pickles for dinner?
There's something to be said. There's a vegetable component. There's also the fact that it was fermented, which is good for your microbiome and your stomach. We could rationalize it.
That for me is my most, aside from maybe getting a break in movies, this for me was my life-changing experience, because I finally was around people that, as maybe other actors experience, like, okay, I'm not a weirdo.
Yeah.
I love musical theater. I think I have created a persona of Liza Minnelli and Richard Dreyfuss. I can somehow fit it into.
Well, you auditioned as Liza, right?
Yes, and I had learned. I mean, again, you just, luckily when you're young, you're just really stupid, and the later emotion that you need in your work of, like, if I don't get this job, I'm going to die, you actually have when you're young. And so I had only learned the song, because again, I was so naive. I got the sheet music and I gave it to the piano player, but I had learned the song off of the record.
This is from Cabaret, right?
From Cabaret.
Yeah.
And I was obsessed with Liza Minnelli. Like, she was my ideal, because I sort of thought in movies, like, okay, I sort of look like her. Maybe I'll have a chance to be in the movies. And so I learned it just like she did in the movie. But as soon as I started singing, the piano player was like a key higher than me and stopped me and said, "You're singing in the wrong key." And I don't know where I got this line from, but I was so scared. I said, "I'm singing in the right key. I'm in the key of Liza." And the whole room of all the people, and it was just like Fame, they were all sitting behind the table. Everybody laughed, and the director, whose name was Clay Stevenson, who was just a great director now, who later passed away from AIDS, but he kind of looked around, and it was my greatest showbiz moment. Like, he looked around like, the kid's got moxie, but, so they gave me another opportunity, and the musical director got up and sat at the piano, and he said, "Why don't you sing and I'll follow you?
I'll find the key of Liza."
Exactly. Yeah. So I started to sing again. And again, it was just like a movie. He's playing, and he quietly looks up at me, and he goes, "You're in C, by the way." And I said, "Yes, the key of Liza." Another huge laugh. And miraculously, I got in. And now I had actual proof for my grandfather that that I had talent, that I had passed my first audition,
and prove to yourself that you had found your people.
Exactly. And once I was in, and it's interesting because I'm still friends with 3 or 4 of the people, but what they all remember about me, which I laugh because again it gets kicked out of you somewhere in the business.
Yep.
Is they couldn't believe my chutzpah. Like, they couldn't believe, the stuff that I would get away with. They would talk about, me coming in and telling the director, if I didn't have a dance number, I made one up for myself. I from looking at Sid Charisse in The Bandwagon or the Fred Astaire, and I would just present it to them. I was like, "Well, I'm thinking I could do something like this," and they'd tell me these stories, and I think, "My God, I wish I had that confidence." Now I don't know where it came from to just I was in my own movie, and I was also thinking, but I was also trying, I think, to prove something to my grandfather that I can.
Interesting.
I can do this. I can, I can make a living, and then he'll take me seriously. The first play we did was Two Gentlemen of Verona. And
that's a degree of separation that we have, because I was in the Broadway Two Gentlemen
with Jeff Goldblum.
Yeah.
That's so
with
funny.
Jeff and Cliff Davis and any number of other people.
Tell me, two gentlemen. Tell me, two gentlemen.
I replaced Raul.
Amazing.
There are going to be more degrees of separation, by the way, before we finish. But
I'm sure there are.
Continue.
Okay, so we did Two Gentlemen, and it was a huge success. I told my grandfather about this, and so I go to visit him in New York, and he said, "I've set up a meeting between you and Mary Rogers, the widow."
Oh my God.
Richard Rogers.
Yeah.
And you can ask her, things about the play. So I always had that feeling of like, okay, I rapidly have to become an adult, asking questions.
Yeah.
I'm just a kid trying to be Liza Minnelli and Richard Dreyfuss, So he would always put me in the position of speaking well, being an intellectual, trying to find thoughtful questions to ask Mary Rogers.
Yes, and enunciate.
Enunciate. Yes, he would always say, don't mumble.
I'm going to make a kind of quick segue here too. You ultimately you end up in New York.
Yes, starving.
Yes, starving. You're living with a bunch of other people in an apartment. Again, starving. Speaking of food, and then you get a job with a PR firm.
Yes.
Peggy Siegel, whom I know from many years. And something happened. Something serendipitously happened that completely changed your life. What was it?
Well, it's two things simultaneously. Yeah. I don't know if you're talking about the Scream. The first thing that happened was that we shared offices with Frank Perry.
Mm-hmm.
He had just done the movie Compromising Positions.
Frank Perry, the director, who had directed.
Yes. I'm there in the office, and although I was probably fired on a weekly basis, I was always because I was always so horrendous with details and not knowing how to Xerox and stuff. But I always thought I knew the reason I kept my job was I knew that Adolph Green was married to Phyllis Newman, but that Betty Comden was his partner. And I could keep those things straight, at a party. So I would know, okay, he's with her and that's her partner. And that's where, and so that's why Peggy, I always thought, liked me. Anyway, Frank gave me this small part in the movie Hello Again. At that point, that was the first time anybody even knew that I had aspirations to be an actor. And that sort of went around the floor. And then I got a call, and I had sent, which I have the photo, I'd taken a picture of myself with my head wrapped in a turban, and I sent it to the casting person. Whose name was Julie Alter, for Last Temptation of Christ. And the postcard said, look at how good I look in a turban. I should be in Last Temptation of Christ.
Chutzpah.
Shockingly, she never contacted me.
Shockingly, yeah.
And cut to working for Peggy. And Martin Scorsese's assistant, who has now heard about me getting this little part in the movie, asks me to send over a picture and resume. She said, oh, we'll have it on file. So it's like within a few weeks, she calls me on the, and I'm down the hall, and she says, I see on your resume under special skills, because again, as you know, back in the day when you had absolutely no credits, you tried to put something funny in some act of desperation that some assistant would read and go, well, they have a sense of humor. Let's bring them in for this bus and truck show, tour. So she says, I see under special skills, it says blood-curdling screams. Do you really have a blood-curdling scream? And I said, yes, I do, because I had done a play in school, and I remember the director telling me that I had a blood-curdling scream. So I put it on. And so she said, well, they need to dub these screams for Barbara Hershey in Last Temptation of Christ. And if you go down at 5:00 today and scream for Marty, maybe you can get the part.
That phrase.
That's exactly.
Scream for Marty.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just, and because I'm an actor, as you know, I was like, absolutely, 5:00.
I can do it. That's right.
And I went down, and again, with complete lack of irony, Chris, because when you're fresh out of acting school for probably, it lasts maybe 5 years, 10 years, you're still really serious. You're still, do they require me to fence in the scene? You can still do a variety of accents. You're very close to an actor, And so when I went down, as I go down the darkened room, there's, Marty, there's Thelma Schoonmaker.
His longtime editor, yes.
Yes, and says, let's hear it, And I said, well, first, if you don't mind, I'm going to do a brief emotional preparation. I'm going to go. No, Chris, no. Can you imagine now? Like, I've done 1,000 looping things. It's like you go in, they're like, look, you're like, all right, you ready? Go. But back in the day, I said, yes, Mr. Scorsese, if you don't mind, I just would like to do a preparation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go in the corner. I'm going to make myself cry. I'm going to do 100 jumping jacks, and then I'll go right into it. And I somehow, again, the seriousness with which I said that, they just said, okay.
Right.
And they all backed up, and I went into the corner. I made myself, cry. I did 100 jumping jacks, and I went up to the mic and, did the screamed, and I did the whole thing. And when I finished, everybody in the room applauded. And he said, my God, that's horrible. How do you do that? And I quipped. I said, well, I work for Peggy Siegel. It's pretty easy.
Yes, that's right.
And then, so I not only did the work, but I got a laugh. And he said, all right, come. And I went back the next day, and it started out as me. First, I just did the screams, but then I redubbed a bunch of different voices throughout, which, by the way, again, I had never done this before in my life. I just, the beeps, the getting rid, I just sort of, again, pretended I knew what I was doing. And, and he said, we have this line here. Do you think you could do this? I said, yeah, okay, so if it was an older woman, I did something stupid, like I put my hand in my mouth and, garbled it. So I'm all over the movie. I'd gone down like 6 times, and I kept thinking, my roommate was saying, are they going to pay you for this? I said, I'm afraid to ask, which has been, again, another through line in my career.
Right.
I'm like, if I ask if I'm going to get paid, I won't be able to do it again.
I'll never work again.
Yeah. So let me just keep going down. And I think eventually they did give me something. And I got I never got a full credit, but I got, I think I'm listed as crowd voices. But that was and then that was like the story of the century. Peggy Siegel got it planted in Cindy Adams. She changed the story substantially, that I was sitting at her desk and that Marty had come by and said, I want you for my next picture. The irony of that, Chris, is that when I went to work in the Brill building, every day I went to work and I said, I'm going to be like Lana Turner and Schwab's. I know I'm going to be discovered. I know I'm going to be discovered. And I was, in fact, discovered just as I had pretended in my mind. I didn't think I was going to be discovered by Martin Scorsese. I thought it was going to be like somebody funny, or, because I'd been a comedian doing comedy, and I was still doing stand-up around this time. And so when I auditioned and got this part in New York Stories is when I actually had to make a decision of whether I was going to go with my comedy career, because I was doing stand-up, or become a serious actor. And I chose, being a serious actor.
And what followed was not only a long-time personal association with Marty, but also roles in Cape Fear, Goodfellas, any number of other movies. And because this is to a certain extent a food show, you end up at one point in your life with Marty, you guys are, I don't know if you were planning on going somewhere, and you get a call from Marlon Brando.
Yes. Did you ever meet Marlon Brando?
No, never. But first of all, the association with food, the story just jumped out at me when I was reading the book. Can you tell the story?
Yes. So we're out in LA. I was doing a movie, low budget, as was most of my career. Low budget movie, which would later become a cult classic.
Yes.
Called Wedding Bell Blues.
Yep.
Really a fun experience. But again, a $900,000 film. Marty was out in LA getting a John Huston, Lifetime Achievement Award. There was always this dichotomy in where we were. But anyway, he's staying at the Beverly Wilshire. And I, go to the Beverly Wilshire, and that's when he tells me, got a surprise for you. Marlon Brando is coming over. He wants to talk to me about this movie. It was actually about John Mitchell and Martha Mitchell. That was going to be the movie that he wanted to make. Mm. And, Marty said, I really doubt I'll be directing it, but I wanted you to meet him. And I just fell apart. I just said, I can't meet Marlon Brando. It's just too much. It would be like going into another dimension. I had pictures of him on my wall and posters and, seeing the rose tattoo and the, I'm thinking of the movie, Orpheus Descending.
Yeah. Yep.
It was just like, I said, I can't. And plus I was in my clothes from the low budget movie. I didn't feel like I was wearing the right thing to wear Marlon Brando, which would be in my mind, black tights and a turtleneck sweater and a beret, and we'd sit cross-legged. And
that you would be so totally friggin' cool.
Right. Like, we'd talk about Eartha Kitt. We'd play the bongos together.
Right, the bongos, bongos, absolutely.
Well, because again, in my mind, it's so imprinted on me, these books, these movie books that I would read, with these photographs, because we didn't have YouTube then.
Right.
So you had these impressions of these actors that sort of stayed with you through the photographs. And so Marlon Brando to me seemed out of my reach to want to meet. Mm-hmm. But I realized it was happening. But Marty cautioned me. He said, the only thing is, don't talk about acting, because he may get up and leave. Don't talk about acting. So
when Ed Begley did the podcast, he said the same thing. He said he would never talk to him. He became friends with Marlon. He would never talk to him about. Yeah. Marlon only wanted to talk about putting electric eels in his pool to harness the electricity to power his house.
Yes. So that already was, I was like, okay, how's this going to happen? Like this, my whole acting career, the whole essence of who I was at that point was down deep, all connected, I thought, to Marlon Brando and the method and all of that, getting into it and starving to death, for a life, because Marlon Brando would do something. So he gets there, and then he's at the Beverly Wilshire, and the door opens, and he's so large that I actually think, okay, we have to back up from the door. Like, we're not going to be... Like, he's standing in the doorway. Oh, and he didn't want to eat we were supposed to meet downstairs, but he said and I think it was because of his weight, he decided he didn't want to eat in the restaurant. He would rather order room service in the room. Well, of course, when I saw him, he was so large, I said, he's never going to be able to get through the door. Like, he's going to have to go sideways, and we're going to have to, so we kind of backed up so that he could get in the room. And at that point, as I recall, I almost just could stop breathing. And it seemed to me like his eyes were unlike, the only other person who had eyes like this was Elizabeth Taylor. They didn't seem to have the eyes of a human being. Like, his eyes seemed to have a light radiating out from them. And I literally could not look at his eyes. I thought, if I look at his eyes, I'm going to faint or pass out. So I was sort of looking down and doing furtive glances like, yeah, that's really Marlon Brando. Like, I'm 3 feet from Marlon Brando. And so we sat on the couch, and I just, because Marty had said, like, don't talk about acting, I was, now just thinking, just be like the silent, pretty girlfriend, just sit on the couch and let them talk. And so to my great surprise, Marty brought up the fact that my grandmother was Helen Gahagan Douglas, because they were talking about John Mitchell.
Yes.
And Brando looked, and I could feel him as I'm looking down. He's looking at me, and I could barely lift my head. And he, Marty said, it's her grandmother's Helen Gahagan Douglas. And I just barely looked up, and I was like, yeah. I put my head down. And then in my head, I was like, idiot, you idiot. Like, just talk. Like, it's Marlon Brando. Just relax. Just talk like a human being. But I couldn't. And then at that point, he must have picked up on something, because I had not met his gaze yet. But he said, all of a sudden I heard him talking to me, and he said, look down at your feet. Because I was sitting kind of like, like this, unbeknownst to me. And I had my feet inward, pigeon-toed. And he said, stop. Look down at your feet right now. Your feet are pointed inwards. He said, you know why that is? It's because you're insecure. And I thought, oh my God, I'm getting the works. I'm getting like a test for Marlon Brando. Like, what am I going to do? And so he goes, are you insecure? And I looked up, and I just suddenly, all my Meisner training, I said, I am insecure, and he goes, now, why would you be insecure? And then that's when I burst out crying. I just started to cry. I just started crying, like, uncontrollably. And I just said, like, because everything I am, I just went back to my Meisner training of, like, don't try to be sophisticated.
Yeah.
Don't, like Meisner would yell at you if you were trying to do anything. And I suddenly felt like he's testing me, and just try to be yourself, whoever that self is. And I just, started crying. I said, everything I am or ever wanted to be is because of you and what you've taught us, and going to school. And I went on this crazy thing. And then he started crying. And then he said, my God, she's a tuning fork. Now I'm crying. So now he was crying. And then Marty jumped up and got Kleenex. And then now he was crying. So then all three of us were now crying in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel.
Right.
And it totally broke the ice, of course.
I would think. Yeah.
And rather than becoming, it was my worst fear come to light. Like, okay, you now, like, I couldn't stop crying. I don't know why I couldn't stop crying, but he went with it. And then after that, it just broke the ice, and we started laughing, and it was like, well, let's order lunch. And then from that moment on, he was there till 11. I mean, I think we finally had to kick him out of the room. It was like midnight.
But the orders were also quite extraordinary as well, weren't they?
Insane. Oh, insane. He was ordering, we photographed it because they were bringing in, room service tables, pasta, steak, shrimp cocktail, and
multiple orders of everything.
Multiple orders. And then we ordered again. And his girth was so big that it was awkward for him. The first thing he did was remove cushions from the sofa to use as like a prop up pillow. He used the cushion, and he sat sort of like a Buddha, with like one leg up and with the big cushion behind him. And then I could tell that, again, even that was uncomfortable. And then he suggested, why don't we sit on the floor, which we did. So we sat on the floor drinking wine,
eating, talking
about acting, talking about Marilyn Monroe, talking about his childhood. It was unbelievable.
And this is all through the day and into the night.
Into the night. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was like 4 or 5 tables
of food and wine and drink. Yeah.
Champagne, wine, desserts.
Right.
You know, we would just get through one thing and he'd say, why don't we order this? You know, and then there would be more stuff coming through, like a Lubitsch movie, you know, more people pushing the trays in. And it was great.
And then when he left, one of the great moments to me in your story in the book is that you and Marty checked to make sure he was gone.
Because his presence, as you know, with some people you meet, it's as if their presence and their essence is so strong.
Yeah.
It felt like, is he outside the door? Like he's going to come. Is he going to come back?
Is he going to come back?
We were in the room, you know, like 2 little kids. I said, we have to photograph this. Like we photographed it like a police scene. I mean, because the room was in
crime scene. Yes,
crime scene, complete disarray. You know,
oh boy,
who would believe it unless we took these photographs? And then, as I said, it was funny. We checked because we thought, is he outside, like listening to us? And then, as I wrote about in my book, it is, I don't know if you have any show business regrets, but it is my biggest show business regret that he sent me flowers and wrote me a very nice letter and then invited me to his house, which I knew could only mean one thing. But I really wanted to go, but I was talked out of it by Marty's assistant. Mm-hmm. I always kind of regretted because I thought,
yeah, I can understand both sides, quite frankly.
Exactly. But I would have had a secondary story.
Speaking of secondary stories, my wife and I were both friends of Roddy as well.
Oh.
Roddy McDowell, whom you have a chapter about in your book. I recommend, by the way, I Blame It on Dennis Hopper by Illeana Douglas as a wonderful read with such extraordinary stories, not only about her life, but about some of the people that have touched her and that she's been in contact with throughout the years, her career. It's a great book. And also your book for those residents, not only of Connecticut, but people who are interested in movies, the book, Connecticut and the Movies that Illeana has written as well. I'm going to conclude our fascinating conversation with a final question. I have a feeling I know the answer because you mentioned it earlier, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I ask all my guests if there is a smell or a taste in your life. Let's say you're experiencing something now, or you experienced something 10 years ago, or whenever, that suddenly takes you back to your childhood. What would that be?
You know, garlic and oil. You know, fried garlic in oil is just an instant tie, you know, to, but there's so many food memories I have, but I would say that instantly gives me a sense of calm, of being in, of being in a calm situation with somebody cooking in the kitchen.
Yeah.
It's just such a wonderful feeling. But there's so many things I have like that. It's hard to pick, you know, just one. Obviously, the smell of basil is always reminds me of my childhood.
Yeah.
My grandmother would make. I know it's like a poor thing, but she would make lentil soup, and she'd always tell me to come in the kitchen. I lived with my grandmother, but throughout my relationship with Marty, my grandmother was living with me, so that was incredible. So he could come over.
Wow. Oh, and have
lasagna and home cooked meals and things like that.
Yeah.
She would always. I don't eat meat anymore, but she would make brujol for him. But I always remember her making, and I still have her little recipe for lentil soup. and she'd always go, "Come in the kitchen," and she, we'd go through how she was making something, even though I knew she would tell me the same thing every time. But it's that way that Italians have of repeating and repeating and repeating, so that when you're standing in the kitchen, it's in you, because it's like being in a play. They've told it to you so many times.
And also you're a character in the play.
Exactly. Yeah. First you're the little girl listening to them, and then you're making it yourself. I always remember too, another funny thing with my grandmother, whenever we would visit her sister's house, her sister lived in Jackson Heights, and my grandmother lived in Flushing, but we would be at the table. My aunt was a great cook too. And my grandmother would be hitting me and just going, "Don't eat that. She keeps a dirty kitchen. Don't eat that. That's not good." And my aunt would be coming in with food, and she would make, it's another great childhood memory, is the Spritz cookies, the Christmas cookies. Mm-hmm. And they would be laid out for everybody on the steps of the house. They would be everywhere. Mm. So that's another great visual that I have of the cookie, that where the whole house would be overtaken with the smell of, butter and sugar of these cookies. Very simple Spritz cookies. But the idea that they'd be laid out on parchment paper or brown paper, all over the house, because the kitchens were so small.
Yeah. Illeana Douglas, thank you. I appreciate your joining us on Cooking by Heart. Illeana Douglas.
Thanks, Chris.